Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall podcast. Last week, or I guess it's about a week ago now, the House passed what do you want to call it? The BIF, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the infrastructure bill. I think it actually has some like technical actual name that I don't even remember right now. But in any case, that was a big moment from a number of different angles. Some good, some arguably within the context of democratic politicking, maybe a little more shaky. But it did kind of reshuffle the deck, and if not move us out of what has seemed like a kind of a deepening and darkening picture for Democrats going into 2022, it at least changed the questions that we're talking about. And unsurprisingly, since it passed, we've seen it is quickly developed into a new party purity test on the GOP side. 13 Republican House members voted for it. And there is at least a move now. I very hard time believing they're actually going to go through with it or that it'll be successful, but to strip those members of their committee assignments. And in the US political system, that that in effect means you're expelling someone from the party. That is kind of that's what you get for being a member of a political party. And the idea that you would I mean, that happens when people get caught killing someone or in a bribery sting or something like that. The idea, or saying something like incredibly racist or something, the idea that you would do that um, for voting for a piece of fairly unremarkable in ideological terms legislation is really beyond unprecedented to even talk about it. And just to remind ourselves, 19 Republicans voted for this thing in the Senate. So this was already not at all a party line thing. What we saw this morning, I guess, ex-President Trump gave a speech at the NRCC, the House Republican Campaign Committee dinner, where he launched into these people, somewhat like he did a few months ago with the ones who voted, well, first the ones who voted to impeach him, then the ones who voted for, various permutations of investigations of January 6th. And one of the members is the congresswoman from Staten Island, who, there aren't a lot of Republicans in New York City, right? And elected Republicans. She's the only one in the House. And at least in the reporting of the New York Post, she was like crestfallen, like, our savior Donald Trump is attacking me. What am I going to do? So we're seeing this whole thing. It has advanced us to kind of to a new reality. I have done a couple posts basically saying how this brings up all sorts of fissures in the contemporary GOP, and Democrats really need to exploit those fissures, not just today and this week, but like every day for the next 12 months. Because, after that bill passed, and again, I think it was I think I permanently lost track of time with the pandemic. It's no longer an excuse since we're a year and a half in. I think it was last Friday. In any case, so almost a week ago. And right afterwards, all the Republicans put out these statements why they voted no. Remember, all but 13 voted no. And they had some differences, but they all followed a pretty clear formula. And there was basically no one supports infrastructure more than me. I am representative infrastructure from the state of infrastructure. I'm so into this stuff, but I could not vote for this. Some of them said because it was at night. It came up at night, and I'm not going to go for voting at night. In other cases, I couldn't vote for it because there's this other different bill that Democrats support, and I don't support that one, so I'm not voting for this one. Okay, that really does not make any sense. And in other cases, just, well, this was not really infrastructure at all. It only spent $9 on infrastructure, and it's a socialist Trojan horse. But the problem there is, again, 19 Republican senators, including Mitch McConnell, voted for this thing. It puts them in a tough position. When they explain why they wanted to vote against this, they seem silly. And that means the Democrats need to be asking them this constantly for the next year. This is how you work at politics in advance of an election. There's a lot about this midterm that is just beyond Democrats' control. They can't undo the fact that it's the first midterm in a Democratic president's term of office. They can't undo the fact that Republicans have the dominant hand in redistricting, which puts them kind of behind the eight ball. You can say they should have passed the For the People Act, but they can't get past Manchin and Sinema, and they can't entirely control COVID or the economy. But these things you can control, so it's really it's very key. Now, what we are going to talk about in a moment is, what about the other thing? What about the reconciliation bill? What about the BBB, the Build Back Better Act? And that's a real question, because the rest of the progressive caucus, the sort of the leftward half of the caucus in the House, held out for a long time, but finally got some fairly hard commitments from their House colleagues, and they took the plunge. But it's really not going to come down to the House colleagues. I think it's going to come down to what Manchin and Sinema are going to do. I think it's going to, but we're going to talk about that. Now, before we do that, let me remind you that the Josh Marshall podcast, brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee. While you're packing up the kids, dogs, and sweaters for your annual visit to your in-laws' house, don't forget to pack a Grady's Cold Brew kit, because without proper planning, drinking a single sip from your mother-in-law's moldy coffee pot will make it even harder on your stomach than watching OANN over family dinner. This is ad copies, very tightly integrated with our subject matter. It was a great thing about Grady's. Luckily, the Grady's Cold Brew Kit makes it easy to drink delicious coffee on the go. Just toss in some bean bags, add water, stick the pouch in the fridge overnight, and you'll have smooth, flavorful coffee all week long. If you're ready to give it a swirl, get 25% off at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. That's Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. Okay, co-host Kate Riga, let's jump right into is the Build Back Better Act, the reconciliation bill, is that just vanishing now, or what's the story?
Yeah, so let's take it to Friday quickly. So the way that Friday worked was all day was back in this kind of will they, won't they, where we were before. Are they going to be able to get these two bills off the ground or not? Because the fundamentals hadn't changed since the last time they had this standoff. Progressives were unwilling to give their votes to the bipartisan infrastructure plan and give away their leverage on the reconciliation bill. So they'd been holding out at first for a full Senate vote on the reconciliation bill first to make sure that Manchin and Sinema were on the hook for that legislation. Then they kind of softened that and said, okay, fine, we're okay with just either a promise from Joe Biden that he has all 50 votes, or, public statements, something promising from Manchin and Sinema that they will be there when reconciliation finally comes up for a vote. None of that happened on Friday. Nothing really demonstrably changed. But for some reason, progressives kind of arrived at the conclusion that this was the best that they were going to get. So they got a promise from the House moderates that those people would be there on reconciliation, even though, like you said, Josh, that's never really been kind of the
That wasn't
biggest
seen
point of
as the problem.
fear.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah.
So they got that promise and a promise that the House would vote on the reconciliation text the week of November 15th. So that's next week when Congress returns from recess. And the progressives said, okay, fine. And we're going to vote for it. Most of the progressives, the squad, AOC, Presley, Cori Bush, that group all voted no. And that stance kind of makes the most sense from an outsider perspective because nothing changed. They didn't really get anything that ensures that Manchin and Sinema won't, on the one hand, gut the reconciliation bill, or on the other hand, vote it down altogether. And that's kind of where we are now. Like, there just aren't a lot of leverage points left. I reached out to the White House earlier this week to ask if there had been a date planned for Joe Biden to sign the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which he hasn't done yet, which could be a potential point of leverage. They basically said, no, we don't have any specific date, pointed me towards the president's statement this weekend where he said, I want all the lawmakers who worked so hard on this to be able to attend a signing ceremony. So on that point, pretty soon we'll be able to tell if that's real or if he's quietly trying to maintain this point of leverage based on whether or not that signing ceremony happens next week, or if he kind of makes up a new excuse with why he's not signing it. But aside
Well,
from that, there's not a lot left to kind of force Manchin or Cinema's hands here.
have you, from talking to people on the Hill, like, is
Mhm.
there a process? Is there a schedule? Do we know at what, like, this has proceeded over the last 4 or 5 months with a series of more or less hard or soft deadlines,
Mhm.
and those have almost all been blown, but they at least give you a sense of the terrain, like, okay, we're building towards this, we're building towards that. I guess in the agreement they made with this handful of House moderates, um, they got November 15th as when they'll vote on it in the House, but
Mhm.
obviously that's not really the whole thing. So, is there any word on any of this?
Yeah, so before Friday, the plan was the House is going to pass both on that day. The next week, this week that we're in now, while Congress is away, the parliamentarian was going to go over the text, the reconciliation text from the House, scrub it, do the bird bathy stuff, all that. And then the Senate would come back and somehow, if everything goes exactly according to plan, be able to vote on the reconciliation bill next week, and then hope that the differences between the House and the Senate text aren't so great that you need to do a conference committee and send it back to the House. So, I mean, that was the timeline before the House kind of dropped the ball on voting for reconciliation. And even that, as some senators were telling me it, we're just kind of like, really? I mean, maybe this could happen if like no one slows down the process and everything goes exactly according to plan, which, as we've seen, hasn't happened with anything this term. And now that they didn't pass reconciliation and the House is going to have to pass it next week, you just shove that whole timeline back an additional week for the parliamentarian to go through it. And, have then there'll be the vote-a-ramas and
Okay,
the
but
two vision.
let's take that timeline on its
Hmm.
face, even if we grant that um, this year hasn't given us a lot of reason to take timelines on their face. So that would mean that the House votes on their version of the reconciliation bill sometime next week. I guess it
Hmm.
was it was on or before the 15th, which is a little less than a week now. Okay, and then what? So then it goes over. The parliamentarian works it over for what, a week or
Hmm.
so,
That's
if
what
it
people
goes
are telling me. Yeah.
according to plan. Okay, and then I guess if Manchin and Cinema then agree on it, then it goes to this votorama thing, which for our listeners is, as part of the reconciliation process, you have to create this thing where kind of everyone and their uncle, who's one of the 100 U.S. senators, can like propose amendments, and it's a lot of poison pill amendments and grandstanding, but it just takes time,
Hmm.
and that's a few days, and then you have the vote. So it sounds like what you're saying is that um, getting if everything went to according to plan, that this would mean passing the bill around December 1st, give or take, early December. Um, Go ahead.
Right. Even though the more likely kind of addendum to that timeline is that Manchin insists on stuff like stripping the paid leave provision out, which the House put in their reconciliation text. And depending on kind of what other hewing down they do, there probably will have to be a conference committee. And then the House progressives will probably have to swallow more bitter pills there because they're going to have to kind of repass a reconciliation text that has some stuff they wanted taken out. Probably not a ton of stuff, but some.
Now, explain to us why it's such a problem if they have to go to a conference committee.
It's not that it's a problem so much. It's just like, basically the reason you need a conference committee is if the House and Senate versions of the bill are different, if they need to be reconciled together. So basically it's going to be a point of contention, right? With things like paid leave, for example, which is something progressives feel really passionately about and is one of those issues where Manchin is like the sole reason why it's not in the bill. And that is just really hard for people to swallow. So, he would likely say, "You need my vote. I don't want to do paid leave." So they have to strip it out. New version of the bill goes back to the House. And then, I mean, what are progressives going to do at that point? They kind of have to just hold their nose and
Well,
vote
and
for
isn't
it.
it, to be, I'm not sure fair is the right word, but to be fair, kind of, we litigated this kind of a week ago,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's not like it's not like a week ago we thought there was going to be paid leave, and now we're going to find out that even paid leave is stripped away. I mean, it was kind of, they made that pretty clear
Yeah.
last
I,
week.
I think that's true. I think it's just there is a great deal of frustration because people feel strongly about this provision, and his reason for not wanting to do it is even like on his gradient of stupid reasons for not wanting to do things, like very, very stupid.
And remind us, what is that reason? Was it that it has to be temporary in the way they want to do it, or what's the story?
Yeah, I mean, it basically boils down to him saying he doesn't want to affect such big policy changes through reconciliation. And he knows that there are some Republicans who will get on board with this, which I mean, I think just has people kind of throwing up their hands because what does that mean? You don't want to do big policy through reconciliation. That's currently the only way to govern thanks to your devotion to the filibuster. So, you know.
And it's also the fact that, I mean, even in the sort of the Mansion micro version of reconciliation, you've already kind of crossed that path. I mean, you're
Yeah.
talking about spending upwards of $2 trillion in a lot of stuff. It's. I mean, I guess you could argue that having it be it's not a federal entitlement exactly, but having that be a kind of locked in part of the social contract in the United States is a significant change. It's not increasing eligibility for something, or all these different kinds of, fiddling with the dials. It's a big thing, which is why people support it.
Right.
And it's funny that it does seem, and I imagine that this is, or I have seen that this is one of the big, you know, one of the big reasons people are having a hard time swallowing this, that it's extremely popular. It's very, very popular. I mean, it's sort of it's among the most popular uh, parts of this. So it's pretty, it's not like I don't know what the least, it's not the sort of the federal defund the police bill of 2022. I mean, it's,
Mhm.
it's popular. So
Right. I
yeah.
mean, and if he actually kind of cared about getting it passed, then there is an alternate option. He could say there actually is Republican support for a paid leave bill. Here are the ones I've talked to. Here are, 10 to 15 of them that are down for it. But the reality is, he'll just be like, "Well, I've been talking to Susan Collins about it." And terrific. Susan gets on board and then the vote crashes up against a Republican filibuster and fails 51 to 49. It's the same stuff he's been doing with the voter bills. He
Right,
keeps
right,
doing this really disingenuous thing where he's like, I can get Republican support, and then he gets Lisa Murkowski. And it's like that it makes no difference. It makes no difference. It's just
right,
he wants to
right,
say it.
right, right, right. Okay, so it seems like what you're telling me, and this is consistent with what I've heard, what I've sensed, is that it seems like this relatively slenderized version of the BBB will pass sometime in December. It would have to be relatively early since they all clear out. There's more and more recesses and vacations and stuff like that. But I guess we'll see at this point. But for our listeners, the next sort of tent pole in this process is on or about November 15th that the House will vote for it. And these moderates, quote unquote, who were the holdup in the House, have committed to they're going to vote for it with the exception of what they call technical fixes. So
Mhm.
and that's so we'll know we're one step further forward if and when that happens, I guess.
Right. And honestly, I don't see at this point House moderates kind of turning on that promise. That would be a pretty drastic thing, but there is the only thing that gives me any kind of pause there is that we're still waiting on a CBO score. Some pieces of it have been scored. The CBO said yesterday that as early as this week, they're going to start releasing scores for disparate parts of the bill.
Right, right, right,
And that is a potential point that we could see moderates make a lot of hay out of if it shows that the bill would increase the deficit. So that's something also to keep your eye out for, which will be, kind of the next couple weeks.
right,
Even though, again, I think that if that the bigger danger there to me is that Manchin sees the CBO score and freaks out. He
right.
tweeted something kind of ominous today about the danger of inflation. And it's just going to be like that. It's going to be every word he says, people are going to be watching with bated breath, waiting to see, oh my God, is he going to blow this whole thing up at this kind of 11th hour? And it's something I've just been really weighing in my head ever since watching the progressives give their vote to the bipartisan bill, because I just after watching how they've acted for all these weeks, my kind of default was they must assume that they just can't get anything better at this point. That Manchin and Cinema are never going to promise to vote for reconciliation. And that, maybe it was the Virginia election that spooked the rest of the Democrats enough to convince them that they can't just remain in stasis. They have to do something. I think that's a fairly likely theory, but it leaves us in this land where the House progressives are trying to keep us from for
Right,
weeks, where
right,
it's just
right.
Manchin and Cinema have all the cards because they don't seem to really care if anything passes or not with reconciliation. So then you're left, with this hope and a prayer that Manchin has kind of come through on the big stuff in the past. He's never killed stuff that he could have killed, and we haven't really seen a lot of proof that Cinema is willing to be out on that limb as the sole no vote by herself. But so you're kind of left making educated guesses based on past patterns of behavior.
Yeah, I think it was the right decision to vote for this thing. Even though I thought it was also the right decision for the progressives to hold the line up until, you know, a week ago. It's a tough decision, but the the Virginia election, and we can, there's all the sort of the different ways you can interpret what happened. Um, the bigger thing to me is the president's popularity. This is hurting the Democrats a lot, and it seemed clear to me that as much as it sucks, these two were never going to go along with this. They just weren't. And you can say, well, that's all the more reason not to trust them. But I mean, I think this was the right decision. I'm cautiously optimistic that this will go through. I will say it's hard to pry these pieces apart because the stuff in the Build Back Better bill is not really inflation moving one way or another. But because it's over a significant period of time, it just doesn't. It's the what was arguably in that category was the relief bill at the beginning of the year. We pumped a lot of money out into the economy, but there was another report this morning that had it's hard to say any one month, but certainly can be interpreted as inflation accelerating, and that will add to these um, weak knees about the Build Back Better Act, even if it's not really have any logical connection to it. And it also has some, some real challenges for Democrats for 2022 and 2024 if this doesn't um, unwind on its own. Because the way you get inflation under control is to raise interest rates, is to slow down the economy. That never helps politically. In a lot of ways, that that's what happened. That's what Paul Volcker did in the early '80s. Blah 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 blah. Everybody has to. I mean, you have to hope for when you fill your gas tank that these inflationary pressures, which are really almost entirely driven by these, supply chain quote unquote issues, that these work themselves out, just because it's not great for prices to keep going up, but also politically, it is a real danger for Democrats, just because they're the ones in power right now. And when there's discontent, the people in power don't have a good time, don't have good election nights. So that's where we are. So what is the so we've dealt with the BBB. I guess
Mhm.
also speaking about 2022, now we're starting to get some visibility into recruitment and the Senate and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, 'tis the season where I'm starting to get texts from, people working on in various campaigns saying, "Hey, it's been a while. Would love to reconnect." So that's how you know.
It's funny. There was someone did a tweet a couple days ago or yesterday, and it was one of these ones like, say something that is, doesn't seem like it'd be true but is true, or whatever.
Mhm.
And so I did in early 2004. I got an email from, it wasn't from Obama, it was from someone setting something up, says, hey, this guy Barack Obama is coming to DC. This is when I lived in DC. He's coming to DC. He'd love to grab coffee with you, and he loves TPM. He wants to chat. And obviously he wasn't president yet, right? He was running for Senate, and at the time, uh, Barack Obama was really kind of a man of destiny, because when he ran for Senate, first his main competitor in the primary, his campaign exploded over uh, a divorce case was opened up, and I can't remember exactly. I don't want to libel anybody, but abuse, bad stuff, and so he was out. And that was one of the big reasons why Obama won the nomination. And then he goes up against this guy Ryan, the Republican, who was married to Jerry Ryan, or actually recently divorced from Jerry Ryan, 7 of 9 in Star Trek Voyager, right?
Mm.
And they had been divorced, and then some press organization opened up that thing, and it came out that one of her complaints was that he forced her to go to sex clubs and have sex in public, and like, boom, then
Wow.
candidate Ryan disappears, and suddenly Barack Obama's senator. In any case, at the time, 2004, I was still kind of doing TPM uh, totally on my own, and it was kind of when the site was still on this kind of meteoric trajectory, and I've never been a particularly organized person. I never even got back to them because
Josh,
I was
Josh,
just too busy.
Josh.
So this is your reminder. You're going to get something from a future president, and you're going to be kicking yourself 20 years later.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's funny because we had this bad election night for Democrats last week, lost the Virginia governor's mansion, barely hung on to the governor's mansion in New Jersey. Um, and it was, kind of doom and gloom. It was prepared. This is what the midterms are going to be. And then it's funny because this week, I think you could argue had a quite a bit of good news for Democrats looking ahead to 2022. Perhaps one of the biggest was that Chris Sununu, the governor of New Hampshire, decided that he's not going to challenge Senator Maggie Hassan in 2022. He's going to run for another term as governor. And not only did he say he's not going to run for Senate, he he went out of his way to list the reasons why working as a senator is a bad job and why he doesn't want it, and how all these people from George W. Bush to current senators swayed him away from the job, and he doesn't want to be there just doing partisan bickering and getting nothing done. I mean, it was quite quite a speech, given that he was being, feted by McConnell personally, and that Rick Scott had flown out to meet him, to wine and dine him. Like, they wanted him to run really badly. McConnell's former campaign manager tweeted unbelievable right while he was doing his announcement. I mean, it was quite a smack in the face, it
And
seemed.
and a key point being, which underscores this, he didn't give them a heads up,
Right. Yep.
which is really, I mean, it's funny to me since I don't wish them well electorally, but that's really a breach. That there's like, I mean, I suspect he just didn't want to have the conversation.
Yeah.
Like, I know what you're going to say. It's not going to be fun. So why don't you hear it on TV? But that's like a real breach. I mean, that's not nice.
Mm-mm.
Um, and I'm not sure he was a shoe-in, but like the Sununu, I mean, the Sununu, for those of you who aren't that familiar with New Hampshire politics, the Sununu family is kind of like there's something in the Constitution that they're the only ones who can run for statewide office. You know, Sununu's the dad, who must be in his 80s by now, was governor back in the 80s, and then was chief of staff, a very controversial chief of staff for the older George Bush. And then I'm trying to think if I get the names right. I think it's John Sununu. So he was the governor. John Sununu was senator. Wait, was he also governor? Was John Sununu also governor and then
You
senator?
talking
In
about
any,
the dad or the brother?
the brother.
I know the brother was a senator. I don't think
I
he
think
was
he
governor.
I think he was in the House and then the Senate.
Yeah.
And then the younger brother is now the governor. So basically they just kind of pass these, but the family obviously has all sorts of juice in Republican politics. And my sense is that he's been pretty popular,
Mhm.
the current guy. Um so but yeah, so that would have been New Hampshire's not it kind of a blue state, but it's also has still has a lot of strong Republican leanings. So having a popular incumbent governor, that's really going to have work cut out for her, for Maggie Hassan, in a kind of a bad year for Democrats. So that's a, a big stroke of luck that Democrats got there.
Yeah, I mean, Maggie Hassan won this seat from Kelly, how do you say it? Ayotte?
Ayot,
Ayotte.
Ayot,
From
yeah.
Kelly Ayotte by 1,017 votes in 2016.
I mean,
So,
it's
I
also
mean,
true there's only 3,000 voters in the whole state of New
good
Hampshire,
point, good point.
but still, yeah.
So, that seat is gonna be a huge target, and then on top of that, you have in 2020, Biden won New Hampshire by about 6 points, 6, 7 points. Sununu won re-election by, like, 30, 35 points. So, you know, Republicans saw him entering this race as one of their best flip opportunities.
So he's running for a third term?
4th.
Wait, do they still have the 2-year terms there? Or is it
Yeah.
4? Oh, they do.
Yeah, 2-year
Okay.
terms because he
Right,
just
okay.
won in 2020 and he's running again in 2022.
Right, so they run every cycle. You
Yeah,
have to keep running every cycle. Got it, got it,
sucks.
got it. Okay. Yeah, it's funny. I actually when I moved to Rhode Island to go to graduate school in the early 90s, they had just moved from the 2-year governor system there. It's kind
Mm.
of old school. It used to be a more common thing, and in some ways it's almost, why not? Right? You can experiment a little more at the state level. It's, presidency, whatever. In any case, that's
Yeah,
interesting.
when I
So
say
good.
it
So
sucks, I meant for the incumbent. I wouldn't
yeah,
need to run that much.
exactly. Well, it's also they have this just kind of unreal system in New Hampshire where they have a massive state legislature. I think like their house is as big as the House of Representatives,
Oh, really? I
and
didn't
they
know that.
have this. I mean, maybe it's not quite as big, but it's massive, and it is they have 2 reps, so I don't know. The population is maybe 1.5 million or a little less. I don't know exactly, but it's a pretty small state, and so like in the House, you can be it's a part-time legislature. I don't if they're paid, maybe they're paid a per diem, and you get elected in the House and you represent like 100 people. I mean, not literally, but pretty close. It's a unique politics, which is, not a lot of else up to do up there. So, sounds fun.
So, right. So we have Democrats basically heaving this big sigh of relief that they dodged this bullet. I reached out to the Hassan campaign and they were basically like, we expect this race to be competitive regardless of who runs. I mean, that's just kind of a fact of how slim the margins were in 2016. But the big, obvious, super popular guy who would have been a massive threat to Democrats, he's out of the equation. And he made it very clear as he took himself out of the equation that being a Republican in the Senate sucks and that he did not want that job.
Yeah, and it does. What are the other examples? Because I guess they want. Is it Steve Ducey who's the governor of Arizona?
Uh,
Um, it's
wait.
Ducey. I can't remember if his name's Steve or not. In
Yeah.
any case, Republican governor of Arizona. I'm not sure. Super
Doug
popular, but
Ducey. That's it.
Doug Ducey. Steve Ducey's the guy is the Fox guy, I think.
Oh, yeah. The
Yeah,
one
the
who always
Fox
fights
News
with the
guy.
press
Yeah,
secretary. Yeah.
exactly. But uh, popular incumbent, and my understanding, and there's this other guy who's like the attorney general. Basically, if you can get a popular incumbent governor to run in a good year, man, you really have the inside lane. But I think I mean, that one's still not determined, but they at least have not gotten him to agree yet. And so possibly you have something developing like what happened in 2010, which is, as most of us remember, uh, the Democrats got clobbered and they lost control of the House, but they didn't lose control of the Senate in 2010 in Obama's first midterm. And the Republicans, it took them two more cycles. They only did it in 2014. And the reason basically was they were getting these like Tea Party whack jobs who just would kind of crash and burn in the general election. And so you could be seeing something like this develop, um, with the different dynamic that you got Trump there. And, I think we're going to, well, tell us about the situation in Pennsylvania. That's
Yeah, my
another sort
gosh.
of
Yeah.
permutation of a similar story.
Yeah, the other one we've been following where Sean Parnell was the leading Republican nominee who then, you know, funnily enough, kind of in the same vein of the stuff we were talking about with Obama's race, he's in the middle of a, bitter what it's custody, not divorce. They're already divorced. Both.
Uh, I think they're probably conjoined, but a
Hmm.
family pulling apart situation. I mean, the custody is the sort of the, so to speak, the child of the divorce. They're inherently
Right.
related.
Which is, all kinds of just nasty stuff is coming out, his wife accusing him of strangling her and hurting the children as well. Um, and so all of that's kind of, volcanoing out into the open and obviously totally dragging down his candidacy. He also has the Trump endorsement. So,
Now, isn't that kind of? It's not that he was the leading guy and then Trump endorsed him. That my understanding is that Trump came into a pretty
mhm,
unsettled
and very
contest and kind of
preemptively
anointed him.
made his
Yeah,
choice.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and we had among the editors at TPM, we had a conversation this morning, kind of saying, these are accusations coming out of a divorce slash custody proceeding, and most of us know a lot of things get said in those proceedings, and you have to kind of see it through. He hasn't been charged with anything. It's an adversarial, it's an adversarial process. But what his wife has accused him of is not just abuse and battery, but like strangling her.
Mhm.
That's pretty bad.
Yep.
And yesterday, did you see that video that those people dug up yesterday? The of that interview with him?
I I read the was this the one that has the misogynistic quotes from it?
Yeah, I mean it's one of these things, and both for you, but for even more for
Yeah.
our listeners, you should watch the video because the quotes are pretty bad.
Mhm.
Women tyrants, not going to take it
Yep.
anymore. men.
We need
Uh,
men to protect us from the dinosaurs.
well, I mean, there's this thing about, yeah, women used to like men being strong because it was to protect them from the dinosaurs. Right? Okay, well, maybe missed in science class. I mean, that's sort of funny, but like, a lot of people talk like that. Um, but again, you have to watch it because those those charges of attacking his wife, of strangling his wife are not proven. They're not even charged in a court of law. But these quotes from him made him sound it makes those charges sound deeply believable. Not just believable, it almost sounds like he's coming down off being hyped up from strangling her. I
Mhm.
mean, it's this stuff about um men not being enslaved to narcissistic mean women and all. I mean, it's like the dude, like, you know keep your distance, this guy's out of control, kind of
Mhm.
kind of sound. Like, he had this one line where he said, I'll be on Instagram and I'm browsing through and I see these women with their duck faces and their selfies and I get so mad. And you're like, dude, if you're like browsing Instagram and you're seeing women's selfies and you get mad, I mean,
Yeah.
dude, that's a bad sign. That's a
Right.
really bad sign. And like, you're gonna run for Senate? Like, really? Um, so yeah, there's that, and I guess I'm not sure who his. I mean, Trump is really. I think it's fair to say that like every Republican but Trump is like, dude, let's not nominate this guy.
Right. Which is, setting off some scramble to see, who else is it going to be. Um, I saw Dr. Oz is contemplating
Oh my
throwing his
God.
hat into the ring, despite the fact that his ties to Pennsylvania seem tenuous at best.
Has he ever even visited Pennsylvania? What are his ties?
I think I think I saw a picture of him atop a horse, and I believe the context was that he was gallivanting around his grandparents' property in Pennsylvania, perhaps. I think that's the strongest tie that I saw.
This is like as a kid, his grandparents had a horse farm in
Well, the
Pennsylvania
picture of
kind of
him
thing?
atop the horse is very current, but
Oh, okay. Got it, got it, got it. Well, who yeah,
yeah.
it's funny that Trump, like I mean, he kind of
Mhm.
it's not surprising because Trump lives in the world of fame.
Yep.
And, Dr. Oz, he's that thing, kind of, I guess he is. I was gonna say he's not really a doctor. He is a doctor, but he is sort of de-doctorized himself with all of his embrace of quack medicines and
Mhm.
all
Right.
sorts of all sorts of stuff. You're from Pennsylvania.
I am. Mhm.
Yeah. So give us some Pennsylvania color. We have this is you gotta give us that insight.
Well, what's kind of funny about this to me is that you look at I was just trying to bring up really quick. I couldn't find it, but Kellyanne Conway also retweeted or boosted someone yesterday who it looks like Republicans are scrambling to try to get behind. I couldn't bring it up quickly. I think it was
It-
some
ver-
kind of like
and not Parnell. So
not
she
Parnell, an
even though she's
alternative to Parnell. Yeah.
interesting. So even though she hasn't broken from Trump, but even she, I mean, it's pretty.
I think people are reading the tea leaves a little bit here. Um,
Yeah, I don't know who else. It's funny. I mean, this is the kind of it really. There are one of the big things that people took from Youngkin's victory was that, hey, you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. You
mhm.
can
Mhm.
supercharge the Trump base, and that really is the story of what happened in Virginia. I mean, there really was not a Democratic fall off. The Democrats did turn out, if you know relative to other recent cycles. It's just that there was an avalanche of turnout in rural red
Mhm.
Virginia. So he had that, but also was able to keep Trump at a distance for the suburbs, basically. Um, and but you've got that thing with Trump where, like, let's say that other Republicans unite together and get behind some other sort of business, kind of bland businessman type,
Mhm.
um, and they defeat this Parnell guy. He's not gonna. I mean, again, if you see this guy, he's not going to go, "Oh, okay, I guess I wasn't the choice of the people of Pennsylvania, so I'm gonna get behind the new guy," and that's not going to happen because he's a hothead and a freak, as you can see with, like, allegedly trying to strangle his wife, and in this nutball interview, and Trump is too. So it's tough. Now we also have to remember that many people, and I'll include myself in this list, kind of thought the same with Trump.
Right.
He's crazy and he's not going to survive a general election. Obviously, he did. Um, Not everybody's Trump though. And that's a hard sell in Pennsylvania, and they've got some good Democrats running for
Yeah.
that seat too.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna mention. Keep in mind this seat is open because Pat Toomey, the Republican, is retiring. So on the Democratic side so far, I think the biggest name contenders are John Fetterman, who I don't know how
He's
much
hard
this is
to.
out of state versus in state because he's become a popular figure in state at least. And part of that is just his look. Like he's enormous. He's got a lot of tattoos. He's got a beard. He hates wearing suits. He comes wearing like denim shorts to everything.
He's also
And
the lieutenant governor of the state.
yeah, which is funny because the Tom Wolf, the governor, is much more your kind of typical looking politician. He's got like gray hair, he wears suits, and then it's him with this huge guy who's wearing casual attire kind of looming over him. So
And
they're a
let's be
funny
honest, with a guy
they're a
who,
funny
like, looks like a Neanderthal.
Yeah.
And here's I mean, the thing, if you I think most people who follow Democratic politics closely nationwide are familiar with him.
Mhm.
Um, Far more in Pennsylvania. I think the key, if you're not familiar with him, if you have not seen him, it's probably a little much for me to say Neanderthal, although it's there's something to that. I think the key with him, and one of the things that he is very attractive to a lot of Democrats, is that if you see John Fetterman, the first thing you would say, Trumper.
Mhm.
Like, if just visually, kind of big, bulking guy, shaved head, um, you know, a
Big beard.
very kind of populist demeanor, talk, all that kind of stuff. But he's a very progressive Democrat. And
Yeah.
go ahead.
Yeah, very progressive. And his kind of pet issues up till this point have, he's very all in on marijuana legalization and criminal justice reform. That was kind of his his big pet projects when he was mayor of what, Braddock?
I think Braddock, and for people outside of Pennsylvania, a kind of prototypical declining industrial Midwestern
Mhm.
city where everybody's leaving, where the businesses have left, and trying to revitalize and keep one of those communities going. And he was mayor of that town for a number of years, and that's kind of where his political brand and political rise have all been about, and
Right.
how he ended up as being a candidate for lieutenant governor.
Yeah, so he's interesting, and I think people like you say his kind of plain spoken. It's funny. It is the kind of this like Trump populist model, but with super progressive politics rather than kind of thinly veiled bigotry type thing. And also his wife is an immigrant and she is very kind of active in politics as well, and people really have taken to her as well. So that's going on. I think in what scant polling there has been, which again, far out from the midterms, not a ton of polling yet, but he has been leading, which is interesting because Connor Lamb, who is who you would the more prototypical candidate for this race, I would say. A moderate in the House, very kind of, doesn't inflame tempers one way or another. He got into the race, I mean, a while ago at this point. And
Isn't he? He's like, has like a suburban Pittsburgh district. It's in the western part of the state, I think, but I don't know exactly
Yeah.
where it is. It's at
Um,
least in western Pennsylvania. I assume it has to be. It must be adjacent or kind of near Pittsburgh
yeah,
or something
you're right.
like
It
that.
is near Pittsburgh, the 17th
Right. So a
district.
swing district that he's a kind of another one of these moderates in the House. And then there's another candidate, an African American candidate who I don't know. It has also maybe a state
Oh.
legislator or something like that. I don't know a lot about but there's a lot of the Democrats have a number of candidates, each of whom in isolation would have a lot of logic for them. Let's say, oh, that
Mhm.
person would be a good candidate. And they have um, either an embarrassment of riches or, when you have a lot of candidates, each of whom have a good argument. Oh, I should be the nominee and what I
Mhm.
represent should be the nominee. That can get acrimonious.
Right. Oh, and the person you're talking about is Malcolm Kenyatta,
Yes. And is
um,
he a state legislator? I think or maybe he's like
vice
in the
chair of
state.
the Philadelphia delegation. Um,
Right, so that must be he's a state legislator from
right. Yep.
Philly.
Yep. Yep. In the General Assembly.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
um, yeah. So that is just a kind of an interesting to get back to how we got on this point. It's just another example of like an open seat in Pennsylvania is primo territory. If the political climate is bad for Democrats come 2022, Republicans are going to be all in. It's not like that's an easy seat to win, kind of in the best of years for
yeah,
Democrats.
yeah,
But meanwhile, it's just, as of now, again, still fairly far out. Not like there's not time for them to coalesce against someone else, but or behind someone else, but their first choice is kind of very publicly, embarrassingly exploding all over the stage. And meanwhile, Democrats, I think, have, you know, a hearty selection of people who all kind of would make sense for the state, but in different flavors of the
yeah,
kind that would
yep,
make sense.
yep, yep. Okay,
So,
all
so
right.
yeah, and
So
I just wanted to give just a quick reminder to kind of wrap this up of the terrain that we'll be watching and that I'm sure we'll like kind of keep talking about as we do these episodes, which is that we've got the open seat in Pennsylvania. We've got the open seat in North Carolina because Richard Burr is retiring.
right, right,
So
right.
that's going to be another big one. We might have an open seat in Wisconsin, depending on what Ron Johnson decides to do, which he's been kind of very coy about. And then for Democrats, the really competitive terrain that they'll be defending, which right now, um, the Sabatos Crystal Ball at the University of Virginia has rated as like total toss ups. In the middle would be in Georgia, Raphael Warnock has to defend his seat because he only got that partial term. Catherine Cortez Masto in Nevada, and then Mark Kelly in Arizona. So
And Maggie
the two,
Hassan. I don't know if she's in the
right.
same toss-up category, but that's
I guess
another.
that
That's yeah.
that just I guess more just depends on who the Republican is at this
Right,
point. But
right,
yeah, yeah.
right, right. No, I mean those two. The Georgia and Arizona ones. That's tough. Those are
Those poor
only.
guys, they just got in and now they have to
Yeah,
run
and I
again.
mean those are, maybe part of a trend that they're kind of trending blue. And I think those states are both at least trending in a purple direction,
Mhm.
but 2022 is not going to be a good test of it, right? Or, not going to be a happy test of it. And so those really, I mean, both of those guys, Mark Kelly and Raphael Warnock, and Mark Kelly in Arizona, Raphael Warnock in Georgia, have to hope that the environment shifts significantly. Not in a way that's impossible, but it has to get a little better than it is now. And then it's still going to be a really tough, you know, really tough fight. So those are challenges.
Exactly, and it's funny, the other thing that it's gonna have to depend on a climate change not climate change, a change in the political climate or Republicans fielding terrible candidates. And,
Well,
we're too early to say that that's what's happening,
Well,
but
I'm curious with Georgia because Herschel Walker, who again, to my like, Gen X mind is still, I see him as a running back. I think he was running back. Um, but as a football guy. But Trump is 100% behind him, and what it seems like, at least, is that this had been another case where Trump was behind him, but all the sort of the mainline Republicans like, no, 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 let's not do
Mhm.
this. But I think McConnell in the last couple of weeks has sort of been coming. I think they recognize that Trump has already made it a fait accompli,
Right.
basically, and so nothing is achieved by taking an iffy candidate and adding party division to it. Having said this, Walker has these, like, a lot of history of seemingly credible accusations of threatening to shoot his wife or girlfriends, or and I guess he's uh, st- allegedly struggled with dissociative personality disorder, which is what used to be, called multiple personality disorder, which I guess possibly has been, if you want to be take a sympathetic view, maybe has contributed to some of this, you know, kind of wild behavior and threats and stuff. But threatening to shoot your wife in the forehead, I mean, that's not something a lot of voters want to get behind. That we don't think of that as like senatorial behavior. He obviously has the, football hero, right? I mean,
Mhm.
got that whole thing. Um, but he um he's kind of like another Sean Parnell. I mean, that's kind of, there's a history of some pretty out of control, unacceptable behavior that that's I would imagine that is some level of challenge, even in a state like Georgia, where in a Republican year, Republicans got the inside track.
Right. Okay, so let's take some questions. The first kind of connects right to what we've been talking about, but I'm interested to hear, Josh, kind of your personal take, which we didn't get into so much. But this is from Joshua, who says, in a relatable phrasing, I haven't been following every twist and turns and the Democrats' legislative purgatory. It's too depressing. But can someone explain to me how BBB, which is the reconciliation bill, has any chance of passing now that Dems have given up their last leverage? So obviously, we talked about that pretty extensively. But what's your, best prognosticating at this point? Like, do you think Manchin and Sinema will let reconciliation pass ultimately?
Yes, I think they will.
I do too.
I am relatively confident of that. Um, and again, going back to what I said before, I think this was the right idea to go ahead and pass this bill, for a few reasons. One is this was cratering the Democrats' standing with the public at large.
Mhm.
It was the impasse was deeply demoralizing Democrats. It was taking not strongly partisan affiliated voters and just showing them that the Democrats are weak and feckless. Like, who cares what they want to do? They're obviously not able to get anything done. That is
Mhm.
also deeply damaging. And they were running out of time to shift this. So I think you have to assume that those two do are willing to pass a small version of the Build Back Better agenda. And now that's assuming a lot, that's trusting a lot given what we've seen from them. But I do put a lot of trust in the instincts of Biden, Pelosi, Schumer, that they have a feel for what is going on here. And look, I don't like giving up leverage. That is just kind of like characterologically against my how I operate in the world. Um, Taking things on hope, believing people who have not necessarily acted in a way to be totally believable. But I think we came down to a point where, was the progressives holding out on this? Was it advancing the ball, or might it advance the ball to give these guys what they want, get out of the mode of standoff, and try to move forward? And it seemed to me it was clear the holding out was not advancing the ball. It just wasn't. It was not working. And will the other approach work? I certainly can't guarantee that, but I think it will. And not working versus probably will work is better than not working.
That's kind of where I come down as well, though if I was a House progressive, I probably would have voted no. I mean, I get why they did, and I think it makes sense, but I also kind of understand why the majority of progressives were like, we're going to now kind of put the onus on the president and congressional leadership to deliver. So we'll see.
Yeah, we will see. For what it's worth, I am cautiously optimistic that basically the current thing will pass.
Yeah, I am too. Okay, a question from Paul. How can the left change the conversation from the Republican talking points that suck up so much of the discourse, like critical race theory, let's go Brandon, and every other outrage they can think of? All I see is kind of laughter, eye rolling, and continuing to fight over Build Back Better, which doesn't seem to be changing what people are talking about. It's funny. I feel like this came up a lot after Virginia and continues to be one of the most fundamental problems for Democrats. And I think much of it is rooted. I mean, we can't talk about this without talking about the fact that Republicans have a whole right wing media ecosystem at their fingertips for which Democrats just don't have any matching thing. So it's hard because there's a world where critical race theory is like the topic du jour every single day. And there's not really a good kind of built-in way for Democrats to combat that with their own left-wing media machine. So then you're left with a choice of, you're communicating on these more kind of like mainstream channels. How do you combat the stuff that's being produced by, Tucker Carlson for this more sober-minded medium and audience? And I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously there is a massive right-wing media infrastructure, and that is just a fundamental imbalance in the media ecosystem in the United States. That's first of all. Another big thing is that the mainstream media, even though it is disproportionately populated by people who probably vote Democrat in most cases, is in many ways still wired for the Republican Party. And that is, in some ways, that is a bigger deal than the existence of Fox and talk radio. They're both extremely important. With Let's Go Brandon and Big Bird and stuff, a lot of that is just sort of right-wing nonsense and bullshit that should just be ignored. The critical race theory thing, I think people need to look at that a little differently. There has been in many parts of the country in the last 2 years, coming out of the pandemic, coming out of what happened with George Floyd, to reassess how we talk about race in schools, how we deal with equity in schools. That is a fact. That is not made up. And many of us think that is a good thing, right? So I think we kind of distract ourselves or fool ourselves getting too deep into, is critical race theory being taught in this or that school? It's just a label for, are we talking about race in a different way, in a more totalizing way in the public schools? And we are. And many of us think that is important and a good thing. And there's a backlash against it, a big backlash against it. So I don't think we should get too hung up on, oh, they say critical race theory is being taught in the schools, and that's not true, and it's misinformation. It is, but the reality is this backlash, and that is in many ways not surprising. That is just a fact that has to be grappled with. And even one thing, we talk about critical race theory. One of the I'm not an expert on critical race theory. I have not read all the seminal texts, but I have a basic understanding of the role of that movement within academics and within activism. And one of the themes of critical race theory is in the civil rights era, in the 50s and 60s, and still in more recently, there was a model that racism is bad, and it is largely because they're racist laws, segregation, legal segregation, and there are a lot of white people who are hostile to black people, think black people are inferior, don't like black people, hate black people. Okay. A significant part of what critical race theory is about is to say the formal laws are only one part of it. And individual white people being hostile to black people is not really the most important or driving thing. It's that the whole system of laws, economy, the culture, that the disempowerment of black people vis-a-vis white people is embedded in those things. And so racism is something that it's great if you hated black people and you kind of see the light and you change your mind, but that's not really the big issue. It's that, again, it is deeply embedded in society itself. And for a lot of us, I think a lot of us consider that second understanding of what racism is just kind of obvious. Of course, it's not just that, like, oh, your uncle is, your crazy uncle is like hates black people and tells bad jokes at the dinner. It is a much deeper thing. Um, so in any case, with the whole critical race theory thing, I think we shouldn't spend too much time obsessing about, oh, it's not actually part of the curriculum, because we are changing how we talk about race. And in a lot of ways, that's something a lot of us think is good and overdue. And there's a backlash against it. And so that's part of that. The final thing with Paul's question, uh, this is one of the reasons it was right to pass that bill. Because as long as the big story from the Democratic Party is arguing with each other week after week after week and doing nothing and not getting anything accomplished, you are going to have the zone flooded with all these kind of, nonsense things from Republicans. So you got to move on. You got to start going on offense. Um, it's hard. The Democratic Party also is. Democrats have to be tougher. They have to be more aggressive. It's also true that the Democratic coalition is structured differently than the Republicans, and that makes that harder. It's not an excuse, but the Democratic Party is a coalition of a lot of pretty disparate groups that don't have a lot in common, and that makes it hard for them to act in the ways that Republicans do, because the Republican Party is and has been for decades dominated by white conservative Christians. That's the bedrock of the Republican Party. And there are Republican Jews. There are a smattering of African American Republicans. There are more Hispanic Republicans. It's not 100% that, but it's dominated by that. So if you're not a white conservative Christian, you're a Republican, you're in their house. They call the shots. And that makes the Republican Party inherently more unified. It makes it much easier for them to go all in on something. It's harder for Democrats because it's actually kind of it's a coalition of pretty different groups. So there's kind of inherent challenges, but did a post last week. It's like everybody's got to buck the fuck up, right? And go on offense and not whine and make excuses and move forward. All right. So let me remind everybody that the Josh Marshall podcast brought to you by Grady's Cold Brew Iced Coffee with I'm yeah, no, I've totally lost it. You can get 25% off at Grady'sColdBrew.com with promo code TPM. That's promo code TPM. All right. Later.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe wherever you listen.